Hello, I'm Dr. David Johnson, Professor of Medicine and Chief of Gastroenterology at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, proton pump inhibitors are very commonly used. The new news is suggesting that chronic renal insufficiency may develop in those patients who are taking proton pump inhibitors. Is it real? Well, there's a provocative study that comes recently published in JAMA looking at a cohort of participants, 10,482 participants to be exact, in the atherosclerosis risk in community study, or ERIC study, and they then did a validation component analysis in a Geisinger health system. It's a central Pennsylvania health system looking at approximately 250,000 patients. What they were trying to look at was exposure over time to a variety of incident risks and what happened to these patients. And one of the things that they started to look at was the use of proton pump inhibitors. The patients were asked to bring all their medications that were prescribed. So again, we're talking about prescription medications, and recognize this analysis includes times from 2006 forward, when certainly we had a lot of over-the-counter medications that certainly could account for renal disease. But when we start to look at the take-home message from this study, it suggests that the odds ratio was around 1.45 greater in those patients taking PPIs that developed incident renal disease. And again, this seemed to co-adjust across a variety of risk factors, and they even did an independent analysis against those patients that were taking an H2 receptor and still suggested the PPI had this incident harm. Well, let's take a closer look at this study, because in particular, when you start to look at incident risks across a large population and you start to co-adjust for a number of variables, there may be a lot of reasons why this patient population may be more subject risk. To start with, the PPI group had a lower glomerular filtration rate right from the start. Again, p-value was less than 0.001. They also had a higher BMI, again, co-adjusting for a lot of other diseases that are associated with increased BMI. Again, p-value in the higher risk patients seen with PPI exposure, less than 0.001. And then we look at things like coincident diseases that, again, are associated with renal disease, like hypertension, p-value less than 0.001, cardiovascular disease, the p-value equal 0.003. And concomitant medications really caught my eye because, again, stratified against the PPI users, they were all higher exposures to things like antihypertensives, again, diuretics, aspirin, and statins. These are all disease states that high risk that associate with renal disease. The p-value, again, in the PPI group for higher exposure was less than 0.001 across all those medications that I just listed. So what do we do with this information? Well, I think that observational cohort studies are a very good way to look at real-world community practice. But again, when you're talking about not really being able to stratify as well across multiple risk factors, and you have a relatively small ratio of harm, odds ratio here around 1.45, again, it starts to question, is it real or not real? We certainly have seen these allegations of harm across things like PPIs and cardiovascular disease, like on community-acquired pneumonia, the clopidogrel issues, the issues as it relates to bone density and fractures. Again, all experts have dismissed these, at least as it relates to real risk, when you stratify across the incident risks that would otherwise cause harm. So again, in this study, I put that in the same perspective. So I think there are two valuable things for us to take away from this study. One, it's a good opportunity to talk with your patients and say, if they ask the question, I've looked at this, I don't really think it's real, it doesn't change what we do in your practice, but if you need the medicine, do you really need the medicine? So if you take the medicine away, it's, again, takes the exposure risk away. But if they don't need the medicine, they shouldn't take it. If they do, you can reassure them, and again, they need to be monitored regularly. The second point is for us as care providers, not to get into the lull of routine refills. Again, this happens very easily in the PPI world, I think. Patients seem to just think they need to take it, and they perhaps don't. Again, ask the question. In our practice, we don't routinely refill a medication if the patient has not been seen in more than a year. So again, as you start to look at electronic refills, it becomes quite easy to click the box. But check when you last saw the patient. Again, there are some real idiosyncratic reactions that occur with really lots of medicines. And the interstitial nephritis is a real reaction, I think, an idiosyncratic reaction, albeit incredibly rare with PPIs. So again, I think it's reasonable to see these people once a year if you're prescribing those medicines. But again, ask the question, do they really need them? So reassure your patients. I don't think the renal issue is a significant one when co-adjust for all the multiple risks. but it's a healthy opportunity to engage your patient. Do you really need to take this medication? So hopefully this puts things in perspective when you get the questions or when you hear about this study. I'm Dr. David Johnson. Thanks again for listening.